She stopped walking. That was the thing nobody understood. Vivian Cole, CEO of Caldwell Global. 11 years, never late, never distracted, never stopped walking. Coffee in hand. Board call in 8 minutes. Lobby full of people moving the way people always moved when she came through. And she stopped. She turned toward a sound. Just a voice. One voice. Cutting through the marble and the morning noise like something that didn't belong there, precise and unhesitating and completely, utterly out of place. The lobby went quiet around her. Not loudly. The way a room goes quiet when something shifts and no one knows yet what shifted. Her eyes found him, a man near the front desk. Work uniform. A mop leaning against the wall beside him. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at anyone in particular. He was simply talking. In a language that made 3 people within earshot turn their heads without realizing they had done it. Then he switched languages, mid-sentence, without pausing. Without thinking. The way breathing changes when you move from one room to another. Someone nearby whispered something. Someone else went still. Vivian Cole stood in the center of the lobby floor with her coffee going cold. And for the first time in 11 years, she did not move toward the elevator. She moved toward him. Vivian Cole did not do mornings slowly. She never had. Coffee first. Black, no sugar, from the executive kitchen on 32. Then the walk. Down the elevator, through the lobby, a full sweep of the ground floor before anyone else had settled in. It was not a ritual she had chosen consciously. It had simply become the shape of her days over 11 years at Caldwell Global, and the shape had held. The building itself rewarded that kind of discipline. Caldwell Global occupied the top 14 floors of a glass tower on South Wacker Drive in Chicago. From the outside, it looked exactly like what it was. A building designed to project power before anyone inside had spoken a single word. Sharp angles, reflective surfaces. A lobby floor of white marble, wide enough that footsteps echoed slightly, not uncomfortably, but enough that you were always aware of your own movement through the space. Vivian had been aware of her movement through that space for 11 years. She had started on 19, Analytics Division. A small desk in a shared office with 2 other people who worked hard and spoke carefully and watched the floors above them, the way people watch weather, with attention, with patience, with the quiet understanding that conditions could change. Vivian had not watched the floors above her. She had simply worked her way through them, 19 to 23, 23 to 28. A lateral move to strategy at 31 that most people around her thought was a step sideways. It wasn't. It was the move that put her in the same rooms as the people who made decisions, and once Vivian Cole was in a room, she did not go unnoticed for long. 32 by 42. CEO before she was old enough to have stopped feeling young. She had learned the building's rhythms the way you learn a language. Not from a book, from living inside it. The lobby cleared slightly when she came through in the mornings, not from fear. She had always been clear-eyed about that, but from the quiet understanding that she was not a person who stopped to make small talk. If you were in her path, you moved. Not because she asked you to, because the momentum of her made you want to. That was how 11 Mondays out of 11 had gone, until this one. She was cutting through the lobby at 8:52, board call at 9. Her phone in her coat pocket, untouched. Coffee in her left hand, still hot. Her eyes were doing what they always did, moving across the space, reading it, logging the things that were usual, and ignoring them, so that anything unusual would register faster. The lobby had its own cast of regulars at this hour. The security desk staffed by 2 people who knew her by name and greeted her with the practiced brevity of people who had learned. She preferred it that way. The receptionist on the far end, sorting through a stack of visitor badges. The cleaning crew always present at this hour, always moving with their carts and their systematic progress across the marble floor. She knew all of this the way you know furniture. Present. Functional. Unremarkable. The visitor near the front desk registered as unusual within seconds. He was a man in a gray suit. 50s maybe. Well-dressed in the specific way that international business travel produces not American tailoring, something slightly more formal, slightly more deliberate. He was standing near the desk, holding a printed agenda in both hands. His posture was the posture of someone who needed help and had not yet found it. He was speaking not to the receptionist, who was occupied, but to whoever was nearest. And what stopped Vivian Cole cold in the middle of the lobby, coffee in hand, board call 8 minutes out, was not the man in the gray suit. It was the answer he was getting. Arabic. Clean and unhesitating. Not textbook Arabic. Not classroom Arabic with the careful pauses of someone retrieving vocabulary from memory. This was the Arabic of someone who had spoken it, since the beginning, the natural role of a native speaker, the rhythm that only comes from immersion. It was Arabic the way rain is water. Effortlessly itself. She turned without fully deciding to. Her body made the decision before her mind caught up. Standing 10 feet from the front desk, mop in hand, was a man she had walked past hundreds of times without once actually looking at him. James Webb, facilities. Morning shift. She knew his face the way you know furniture present, functional, unremarkable. She could not have told you the color of his eyes. She had never had a reason to know. She had a reason now. James did not seem to know anyone was watching, or if he knew, he had decided it didn't matter. He was focused entirely on the man in front of him, following the visitor's rapid, slightly panicked Arabic, tracking the specific confusion of someone who had an agenda and a floor number, and no idea how they connected to each other inside this particular building. He answered without hesitation. Not translating, not approximating, conversing. Following the man's sentences and responding in kind, with the ease of someone who had done this 10,000 times. The visitor's posture changed immediately. The held breath quality of a person who has been lost and suddenly isn't. He gestured toward his printed agenda, and James nodded, explaining something. Vivian couldn't follow the content, but she could read the shift in the room. The visitor was no longer lost. James had found him in the space of 30 seconds. Then a woman from the operations department came around the corner of the side hallway. She was looking for a supply room. She asked the question in English, but James heard it mid-sentence in his Arabic response to the grey-suited visitor, and he shifted. Not after he finished. Not after a breath, mid-sentence. The way a river finds a new channel without stopping. The Spanish that came out was different from the Arabic. Softer. Faster. With a regional texture that Vivian couldn't immediately place, something warmer than the Spanish she had heard in conference rooms. Something that had been lived in rather than studied. The woman from operations thanked him and walked away. She did not look particularly surprised. As though this was not unusual. As though she had perhaps seen it before. And simply stopped registering it. Vivian had not stopped registering it. She was standing in the middle of the lobby with her coffee going cold in her hand when James's phone buzzed in his shirt pocket. He glanced at the screen, held it to his ear, German clipped. Deliberate. The kind of German spoken in a professional context, not a social one. He was explaining something about a document, a shipment schedule, maybe, or a logistics question with the register of someone who had done business in that language. Not a tourist's German. Not a student's German, he was just talking. The grey-suited visitor had found his floor number, thanked James with visible relief, and was moving toward the elevators. The phone call ended. James put the phone back in his shirt pocket and picked up the mop he had left leaning against the wall. He went back to work, moving the mop in slow, even arcs across the marble floor. No glance around to see if anyone had noticed. No pause to assess whether the last 4 minutes had been remarkable. They had been remarkable. He appeared to have no awareness of this. Vivian walked toward him. "Excuse me." Her voice came out more direct than she'd intended. She didn't soften it. He looked up. The face she had never actually looked at was calm. Not guarded. Not nervous. Just calm, the specific calm of a person who had very little left to prove to anyone. Mid-30s. Tired eyes that were still sharp underneath the tiredness. He looked at her the way most employees looked at her, with recognition, and with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to read a room. "Yes, Miss Cole." His voice in English was quiet, measured. The flat, clear American English of someone from the Midwest. "That was Arabic you were speaking," she said. "And Spanish. And German it was," James said. He didn't offer anything else. He didn't apologize for it. He didn't explain it away or launch into a story. He simply confirmed it and waited, holding the mop handle lightly, watching her the way a person watches weather. She looked at him for a moment. 11 years at Caldwell. She had interviewed hundreds of people in that time. Sat across from candidates with polished resumes, rehearsed answers, and the particular confidence that expensive education produces. She had a well-developed sense of when someone was performing competence and when someone actually had it. James Webb was not performing anything. If anything, he looked mildly inconvenienced by the conversation. Not rude, not dismissive, just genuinely uninterested in impressing her. That more than anything else held her attention. "How many languages do you speak?" she asked. James considered the question, not deciding whether to share the number, deciding whether the number was accurate. 9, he said, "depending on how you count one of them." "I'm still working on the 9th. She processed that. "Which ones?" "English, Spanish, Arabic, German, French, Portuguese, Mandarin, Russian," he said, "and Farsi." "That's the one I'm still filling in." He said it in a flat, informational tone. No pride attached, no performance, which somehow made the list more striking than if he'd delivered it with ceremony. Pride would have given her something to push back against. This gave her nothing to push back against. "Come upstairs with me," she said. James looked at her like she had said something slightly absurd. Which, from his position at 8:55 in the morning with a mop in his hand and a half-cleaned lobby behind him, it probably was right now, he asked. "Yes, I'll have someone cover your shift for the hour." He set the mop against the wall, carefully, with the specific care of someone who intended to come back for it. He didn't say anything else. He followed her to the elevator. Vivian faced forward as the doors closed. She looked at her own reflection in the polished steel and tried to decide, analytically, what she was doing. She knew what she was doing. She was doing what she always did when something didn't fit the pattern she expected. She was going to find out why. Her office was nothing like the lobby. No marble, no high ceilings, no architecture designed to make visitors feel small and impressed. 32 was a working floor, 2 monitors. A long conference table pushed against the window with briefing folders stacked by date. A view of the Chicago skyline that had been extraordinary the first time she saw it and had become, over 11 years, simply the view from her window. She had stopped actually seeing it somewhere around year 4. She gestured toward the chair across from her desk. James sat, still in his work uniform, still with the same unhurried expression. He didn't look around the room the way most people looked around her office, cataloging the markers of power, deciding how to position themselves against them. He just sat, as though the chair across from the CEO's desk was simply a chair. She got straight to it. "How did you learn 9 languages?" He answered the way he had answered everything so far, without embellishment, without the rehearsed quality of a job interview, without the careful pacing of someone who has prepared for this question and is now delivering the prepared answer. "Spanish in high school." He'd had a gift for it. That was how he put it, not with pride but with the same flat accuracy he used for everything. He'd gone on to study linguistics at the University of Illinois at Chicago. French and Portuguese came during college, through coursework and then through practice, through long hours outside the classroom, trying to make the language live inside him rather than just sit on the surface. He described the difference: the language that sits on the surface versus the language that lives inside the way. Someone describes a distinction they've thought about carefully, as though the difference between those two things was the most important thing he had learned in 4 years of formal study. Maybe it was Arabic had come later. A roommate first, then books, then a period of what he described as serious study, 3 years of his own time, his own money, working through the grammar and the sounds and the specific music of the language until it stopped feeling foreign. German had followed, then Russian, then Mandarin, which had taken the longest and which he still considered his weakest of the 8 he regarded as complete. He said this with the same flat accuracy, not false modesty, not performance of humility, just the honest assessment of someone who measured his own capabilities against a precise internal standard. He said all of this the way someone recounts a route they've driven many times. Familiar, unremarkable. "You studied linguistics," Vivian said. "But you didn't finish." No, he didn't look away from her when he said it. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one. Just a pause, the kind that exists when something is about to be said that requires a moment of its own. "I was 2 semesters out," James said. He stopped. He seemed to weigh something, not whether to tell her, but how to say it with the appropriate amount of accuracy. How to give her the fact without either minimizing it or making it larger than it was. "My wife got sick. Stage 3 ovarian cancer." He said it with the steadiness of someone who has spoken those words enough times that the sharpest edge has worn smooth, but the weight has not gone anywhere. It has simply become familiar. Something you carry rather than something that knocks you down. The weight doesn't change. You change around it. She passed 14 months after the diagnosis. Our son was 4 years old. Vivian kept her expression neutral. She was good at that. It was a skill she had developed over years of boardrooms and difficult conversations, and the particular discipline of leading through other people's crises without letting her face become another variable in the equation. But something shifted behind it. Something she could not have named precisely and would not have tried to. After that, James continued, I needed work that paid consistently, and that gave me flexibility for school pickups and sick days. And the particular chaos of raising a child alone, he said it without bitterness, without the edge of someone recounting an injustice. Corporate jobs wanted the degree. Freelance translation paid well sometimes, and nothing other times. Janitorial work paid every 2 weeks. And the supervisor at the time was willing to let me adjust my shift around my son's schedule. He said it as a sequence of logical decisions made under pressure. That was all. That was what it was. Not a tragedy he was asking her to witness. Not an explanation he was offering in hopes of sympathy. Just the sequence of things that had happened and the sequence of choices he had made in response. Vivian looked at the man sitting across from her. No completed degree. No corporate experience. No resume that would survive the first automated filter in Caldwell's hiring system. By every standard measure her HR department used, James Webb did not exist as a candidate for anything above a facilities role. The system had not built a box for him, and so the system had left him mopping the lobby for nearly 6 years, every Monday morning. Walking past hundreds of people who were too busy going somewhere to look up, she thought about the board call she had missed. She had sent her assistant a message from the elevator saying she'd join late. She had not looked at her phone since. This conversation had already cost her 40 minutes of a structured Monday morning. She was not irritated about it. That, in itself, told her something. I have a meeting this afternoon, Vivian said. James waited. He was, she had noticed, very good at waiting. He did not fill silence. He did not lean forward with the eagerness of someone trying to demonstrate engagement. He simply waited, with the settled patience of a person who understood that the next thing would come when it came. An emergency session. A partner group flying in from Dubai. Our scheduled interpreter cancelled this morning family emergency. She kept her voice even. The meeting is about a logistics contract worth approximately $14 million. It involves 3 senior executives who conduct almost all their business in Arabic. She let that sit. I'd like you to be in the room. James looked at her steadily. As the interpreter? Yes, he thought about it. She could see him actually thinking, not performing hesitation, not calculating the polite answer, not running through the optics of the situation. He was working through something real. His shift schedule, the afternoon logistics, what it would mean to walk into a Caldwell boardroom in his work clothes to help close a $14 million deal. Whether this was the kind of offer a person accepted or the kind that came with strings he hadn't yet been shown. My shift ends at 2, he said. My son's school pickup is at 3:15. If the meeting runs long, I'd need someone to cover that. I'll have my assistant arrange a car service for the pickup. What's his school? Jefferson Elementary. On West Adams, he said it with a slight look that she understood. A look that noticed she had offered without hesitation. That noted the fact, filed it somewhere, the way he filed everything, and wasn't sure yet what to do with it. 2 o'clock, she said. Conference room B, 31st floor. I'll have someone bring you a clean shirt. James stood. He tucked the chair back in neatly the same way he had set the mop against the wall. With the care of someone who respects the spaces they move through, who leaves things in better condition than he found them as a matter of principle rather than performance. At the door, he stopped. Miss Cole? She looked up. The lead executive from Dubai. His name is going to be difficult for most of the room to pronounce correctly. And he notices when it's wrong. James said it plainly, without drama. It won't end the meeting, but it starts things on the wrong foot. First impressions in Gulf business culture carry more weight than most Americans realize. Vivian looked at him. Go on, I'll write it out phonetically for you before 2 o'clock. Practice it 2 or 3 times. It matters to him not the correctness so much as the effort. He'll know you tried, and that will open the room in a way that nothing else in your preparation will. She held his gaze for a moment, thinking about everything he had just told her. Not just the pronunciation, but the cultural logic behind the advice. The understanding that the room is open before the meeting begins. That the first 2 minutes determine the temperature of the next 2 hours. "Thank you," she said. He left. She sat back in her chair and looked at the Chicago skyline she had stopped seeing years ago. The towers on South Wacker catching the late morning light. The river below, moving in its slow, indifferent way. She looked at it for a long time. Before she went back to her emails, she did 2 things. She called the HR director and outlined the situation: the cancelled interpreter, the afternoon meeting, the plan to use James Webb as a temporary resource. The HR director raised no objection to that. Then she said she might want to discuss a longer-term arrangement after the meeting, and asked the director to start pulling the relevant compliance requirements for an expedited role change. The HR director paused, then said she would have the information ready by end of day. Vivian thanked her and hung up. She had 8 minutes until her rescheduled board call. She used 6 of them to respond to the most critical emails in her inbox. She used the remaining 2 to sit quietly and think about a man who had learned 9 languages in the hours other people spent on other things, and who had just told her that how you say someone's name matters more than most Americans realize. He was right about that. She knew he was right. She had simply never heard anyone in this building say it so plainly. The phonetic note arrived at 1:40, a folded piece of paper, slid under her office door. Clean handwriting, precise, economical, the handwriting of someone who has trained themselves to write clearly under all conditions. 3 lines. The name Hamdan al-Khalidi, broken into syllables the way a musician might notate a rhythm. The stress marks placed carefully. A note on the vowel sound in the second syllable, with a single line underneath in the same neat hand. He will notice. It's worth the 30 seconds. Vivian read it 3 times, said it out loud twice, alone in her office, which was not something she was accustomed to doing. The sounds felt unfamiliar in her mouth. She said them again. Better. She went downstairs at 1:55. James was already in conference room B when she arrived. He had been there for 20 minutes. She would learn later had let himself in with his building access card, which still worked on floors he no longer officially worked on. Nobody had thought to update the permissions yet. He was wearing a pressed white dress shirt that her assistant had sourced from the building's concierge service, and he was seated at the far end of the conference table with a single notepad in front of him, face down. He had also brought, she noticed, a copy of the meeting agenda, one she had not sent him. He had gotten it through some other channel. She didn't ask how. The margins were already annotated. He looked like he belonged there. Not in a performed way. Not with the forced ease of someone who has told themselves to act comfortable in an unfamiliar setting. In the way that people who are genuinely competent occupy space quietly, without announcement, with a kind of settled readiness that has nothing to prove and no performance to maintain. The Dubai group arrived at 2:08. Hamdan al-Khalidi was a precise man. Formal. Somewhere in his late 50s, with the bearing of someone who had been in important rooms for a long time and had stopped finding them impressive. He had the handshake of a man who measured people in the first 3 seconds and had developed, over years of doing it, an extremely accurate system. He shook Vivian's hand, said her name, correct on the first try. Then he moved his attention to the rest of the room in the methodical way of someone who catalogues before he commits. Vivian said his name, Hamdan al-Khalidi. The syllables she had practiced alone in her office. She did not rush them. She got the stress right. His eyes came back to her. Something shifted in them, small but real, not surprise exactly. Something closer to recalibration. The adjustment a person makes when a room turns out to be slightly different from the room they anticipated entering. "Miss Cole," he said. The formality in his voice was the same, but something underneath it had adjusted slightly. A fraction of a degree warmer, a fraction more open. James had been right. It was worth the 30 seconds. The meeting nearly didn't survive its first 18 minutes. The problem was not language exactly. Language was the medium. The problem was register the specific cultural frequency on which professional communication operates, which varies more than most American business people understand, and which, when misaligned, creates friction that both parties feel but neither can precisely identify. The Caldwell legal team's deputy director used a phrase in an attempt to clarify a contractual concern. In standard American business English, it was a perfectly reasonable clarification. Direct, clear, professional. The kind of language that in an American negotiating room signals competence and precision. In Gulf Arabic business culture, in this context, with this specific group of executives, it landed closer to an accusation than a clarification. Not intentionally. Not through any failure of goodwill. Simply through the gap between what the words meant in one cultural register and what they implied in another. The shift in the room was immediate and invisible to most people in it. Hamdan's posture changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have read as offense to anyone watching casually. His hands, which had been resting open on the table, a posture of engagement, of readiness, moved together, closed slightly. His two colleagues exchanged a look that lasted less than a second. The Caldwell team didn't notice any of it. James noticed all of it. He had said nothing for the first 8 minutes. He had listened. He had read the room the way she had watched him, read the lobby quietly, comprehensively, without announcing what he was doing. Building a complete picture before he responded to any part of it. Now he turned toward Hamdan al-Khalidi and spoke. Not to translate what had just been said, to reframe it. He spoke in Arabic, calm, unhurried, at the register of a professional conversation between equals. Not subordinate, not deferential, equal. He acknowledged the concern that the phrase had created. He explained the intended meaning with the precision of someone who understood both what had been said and what had been heard, and who could bridge the gap between them without making either party responsible for the gap's existence. He did it in a way that was respectful without being obsequious, clear without being defensive, and this was the part that struck Vivian most, without drawing attention to the fact that he was doing it. He did not announce the repair. He simply made it, the way a skilled editor makes a correction without leaving a mark. Then he turned back to the room and gave the Caldwell team a path forward in English, a way to continue without anyone having to visibly back down. Without anyone having to acknowledge that there had been a problem, without anyone losing the specific kind of face that matters in a room like this. The shift was immediate. Hamdan's hands opened again on the table. He responded in Arabic, something short, something measured, something that made one of his colleagues almost smile. James translated evenly. He says the clarification is satisfactory. He'd like to continue. Vivian moved the meeting forward. What followed was 90 minutes that she would think about for a long time afterward. Not because of the outcome was what it was. A signed letter of intent. A follow-up session scheduled for 2 weeks out, $14 million given shape and direction, and a next step. She would think about it because of what she watched James do inside those 90 minutes. Because it was unlike anything she had seen in 20 years of professional rooms. He worked with the precision of someone who had spent years studying, not just languages, but the people who speak them. He caught 3 more instances where cultural register was creating friction that nobody else in the room could identify. A phrase that implied impatience in a context that required patience. A response that, translated literally, would have suggested a closed position when the actual position was still open and exploring. A silence from Hamdan's side of the table that Caldwell read as hesitation and that James understood as consideration, and so he gave the room the time it would otherwise have rushed past. He navigated each one without stopping the meeting, without making anyone feel corrected, without making himself the center of anything. The letter of intent was signed at 4:17. When Hamdan al-Khalidi stood to leave, he shook hands in sequence around the table. Professional, correct, appropriate for the conclusion of a substantive business session. When he reached James, he stopped. He addressed James directly in Arabic, not briefly, not formally, not in the clipped register of professional courtesy. He spoke for nearly a full minute. Steady, something in it that felt to Vivian like a man saying something he had decided to say, rather than something the situation required him to say. Then he shook James's hand, shook Vivian's hand, nodded to the room. Left with his team, the conference room emptied. Vivian and James were the last ones. The table between them scattered with documents, with the small debris of a working session. The Chicago skyline through the window was going amber, with late afternoon, the particular bronze of October at 4 o'clock, when the sun drops low enough to hit the glass towers straight on and turn the whole city into something that looks briefly like it was designed by someone who cared about beauty. What did he say? Vivian asked. The full minute. At the end, James looked at his annotated contract pages. He squared them slowly, aligning the edges. The same care he applied to everything. He said Caldwell is the first American company in his 15 years of working in this market that has ever bothered to actually meet them. He paused, not just translate, meet. He said there's a difference, and most companies never discover what it is. He set the pages in his folder. He said he intends to recommend expanding the partnership scope at the next executive review. Another pause, longer this time. And he asked me a question. Vivian waited. He asked why I was only being called in now. Why it took this long. The room was very quiet. Vivian had no answer to that. Not one she could say out loud without it being an indictment of the building, of the system, of every morning she had walked through the lobby with her eyes forward and her coffee in her hand and her schedule clean. I don't have a good answer for that, she said. James looked at her. Something in his expression was not quite a smile, not accusatory, not bitter. Just the particular, settled recognition of a man who had already made his peace with a question that didn't have a good answer, and who appreciated more than he would say that she hadn't tried to manufacture one. I know, he said. He picked up his folder. Stood, I'll have a summary of the session outcomes in your inbox by 7, he said. And he left. That evening, Vivian Cole sat at her personal laptop and typed a job description. Before she sent it, she did what she should have done that morning. She called the HR director at home. She outlined the full situation, the Dubai meeting, the outcome, her assessment of James Webb's capabilities, and her intention to offer him a permanent role. The HR director listened to all of it without interrupting. This is irregular, the HR director said. When Vivian finished, I know, a formal search process normally takes 6 to 8 weeks minimum. I know that too. If you want to move forward on an expedited basis, I can have legal review the compensation terms tonight and put together a conditional offer framework by morning. 30-day performance review, parallel search process, full documentation. It won't be standard, but it will be defensible. Yes, Vivian said. That's what I want. I'll have it ready by 8. The documentation arrived at 7:52. Vivian reviewed it, made 2 adjustments. Then she wrote the role description herself, in plain language, and called it Global Communications Liaison. She set the salary at a number that reflected what the role was genuinely worth to the company, not what the market expected for someone without a completed degree. She attached a note. 3 sentences. This is a formal offer, conditional on the expedited review now underway. Take the time you need. I hope you'll say yes. She sent it to his employee file at 7:43 in the evening, copying the HR director and legal, at 6:58 the following morning, before the building was fully staffed. Before the coffee had finished in the executive kitchen, her assistant forwarded her a reply. 1 line, I accept. Thank you for looking up. She read it twice. She thought about what it meant to be looked at finally, after years of moving through a world that had decided what you were without asking what you could do. She thought about what it cost a person to keep showing up anyway, to keep mopping the marble with the same care on year 6 as on year 1. To carry 9 languages in your head and take them out to help a confused visitor find his conference room, not because anyone would notice, not because it served any ambition, but simply because a person needed help and you had the thing they needed. She thought about what kind of character that takes. Not talent alone. Talent without character is just potential sitting unused. What James Webb had was something more specific, the decision, made somewhere in the hardest years of his life, to keep becoming more than the world had decided he was. Not for the world, for himself, for his son, for the private standard he held himself to when nobody was watching. She thought about all the lobbies in all the buildings in this country, where the same thing was happening every day, the quiet and extraordinary capability of people. The system had filed in the wrong drawer and left there. The announcement went out company-wide at noon. By 2 o'clock, her assistant had forwarded 11 emails from department heads and middle managers. The language varied. The message did not. He's not qualified. He doesn't have the credentials. This sets a bad precedent. What does this say about our standards? One email was more direct. It came from Derek Shaw, Communications Department, 9 years at Caldwell, who had applied for a global role the previous spring and not gotten it. Not because the role had gone to someone else, but because the role had been restructured and the hiring process suspended. He didn't know that. He had simply received a form letter and spent the month since quietly recalibrating his ambitions. He wrote that promoting a janitor without a degree into a communications position was, in his words, a morale problem waiting to happen. Vivian read every email. She did not respond to any of them that afternoon. She saved them all in a folder she labeled, simply, later. She had learned a long time ago that the loudest objections to a decision were not always the most important ones. Sometimes they were just the first ones, the noise that came before the room settled into the truth of what had actually happened. The truth was on her desk, a signed letter of intent. $14 million, given shape by a man in a borrowed shirt who had written her a phonetic pronunciation note and been right about every single thing from the moment she had stopped walking and turned around. The question was not whether she had made the right call. The question was what would happen next, what it would cost, what the system would do when a decision it hadn't anticipated started producing results it couldn't ignore. She was about to find out. The 31st floor was not the lobby. The lobby had its own logic. People moved through it. They came and went. They had somewhere to be. Nobody lingered long enough to form an opinion about what they saw there. The lobby was a place of transit, of first impressions, of the 10-second assessments people make when they pass through a space without stopping. The 31st floor was different. 31 was where the international partnerships team worked, where the senior communications staff worked, where the people who had spent years building specific kinds of credibility inside Caldwell Global sat at their desks and measured each other in the quiet, continuous way that competitive professionals measure each other. Not maliciously, mostly, just honestly. Just with the accumulated awareness of people who understood that in a company this size, reputation was currency, and currency moved in ways that weren't always visible on the org chart. This was a floor that kept score. James Webb arrived on Monday morning of his first week in the new role at 7:45. 15 minutes before anyone expected him. He had his own office, now a small room at the far end of the hall that had previously been used for storage. It still smelled faintly of cardboard and old paper. The desk was standard issue. The chair needed adjusting. The window looked out at the side of another building rather than the skyline. He did not appear to mind any of this. He was at his desk when the first colleagues began arriving at 8. Computer open, 3 documents on the screen, cross-referencing something across what appeared to be Portuguese and English. A legal pad beside the keyboard, already half filled with handwritten notes in what looked, to the people who noticed, like 2 different languages. People noticed, not warmly, not with the open curiosity that a new colleague might hope for. They noticed the way a floor notices something that doesn't fit its established pattern with the flat, measuring attention of people who had not been consulted, and were not yet convinced and were reserving judgment while they gathered more information. Derek Shaw arrived at 8:05. His desk was midway down the corridor, close enough to James's office that he would pass it multiple times a day. He glanced through the window as he went by the first morning, saw James at the desk, focused, already working, said nothing, kept walking, but his pace slowed fractionally, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough. The involuntary hesitation of a man encountering something that didn't yet fit into his understanding of how things were supposed to work. Vivian watched none of this directly. She was on 32, separated by a floor and an elevator bank. But she had sources, not formal ones, not surveillance. Just the ordinary intelligence gathering of a person who had spent 11 years learning how this building worked. She knew which assistants talked to which other assistants. She knew which department heads gave her accurate pictures and which ones gave her the picture they wanted her to see. She knew within 48 hours of James's arrival on 31 what the general temperature of the floor was: cold. Watchful. Not hostile, not yet, but profoundly unconvinced. She had deliberately not intervened. Intervention would have made things worse. It would have confirmed the suspicion already circulating that James Webb had gotten his position through the CEO's personal sponsorship rather than through any legitimate process. The only thing that was going to move this floor was results. Results took time. Time required James to be present on this floor, long enough for people to see what he actually did. So she watched from a distance and let it unfold. And what she watched, in those first days, was a man who understood exactly what he was walking into and had decided to walk into it anyway. He was early to every meeting. He was prepared for every call in several cases. more prepared than the colleagues who had been briefed for weeks, because he had spent the night before reviewing not just the materials he'd been given but the underlying contracts and correspondence those materials were based on. He kept his interactions professional and brief. He did not make small talk. He did not try to win anyone over. He did not behave as though he needed the room to like him in order to do his job. That restraint was the right instinct. It was the instinct of someone who understood that on this floor, at this moment, performing warmth would read as desperation. What he needed to do was demonstrate competence, and he needed to do it through the work itself, not through the social machinery that surrounded the work. The restraint was also, she suspected, costing him something. She could see it at the end of each day. A slight set to his jaw when he passed her office on the way to the elevator. The particular tightness of a person carrying something they have decided not to put down. He never stopped. He never lingered. He went straight to the elevator, and she would catch a glimpse of his face as he passed, composed, controlled, the expression of someone who had decided what face to wear in this building, and was wearing it precisely. On Wednesday evening of his first week, she was still at her desk at 6:30. Most of the floor had cleared. She gathered a folder she needed for tomorrow and walked down the corridor. His office light was still on. She slowed. Through the narrow window beside his office door, she could see him at his desk. Documents opened something in Portuguese on the left screen, a contract template on the right. His attention moved between them with the focused efficiency of someone who was not wasting a minute of the quiet. But it was the corner of the desk that stopped her. A drawing, done in crayon, the thick, confident lines of a child who has not yet learned to be tentative about what he makes. A house, simple, square with a triangle roof and a door and 2 windows. A sun in the upper right corner with rays going out in all directions, the way children always draw suns. As though the sun itself is generous, as though light goes out equally in every direction without being asked. And at the bottom, in the large, uneven capital letters of a 9-year-old learning to make words permanent, No plus Dad D. Vivian stood in the corridor for a moment. She did not go in. She did not announce herself. She just stood there in the dimmed hallway and looked at that drawing in the corner of a storage room turned office at the end of the 31st floor, and felt something move in her chest that she did not try to name. She was thinking about a man who had come home to that boy every single day for 5 years after losing his mother, who had made dinner, helped with homework, listened to whatever a 9-year-old needs to say when the world has already taken something from him that it should not have been allowed to take. And then, in whatever hours were left after the boy was in bed, had kept learning, had kept filling in the spaces, had kept becoming more than the system, had decided he was not to impress anyone, not to position himself for advancement, but because becoming more was simply what he did with the time he had. The drawing in the corner of the desk was not a decoration. It was a compass. She walked back to her office. She did not go home immediately. She sat at her desk in the quiet of 32 and thought about the series of decisions she had made since Monday, not with sentiment, not with the soft light that hindsight sometimes casts over good decisions, but with the clear-eyed assessment of someone reviewing a sequence of moves for structural error. She could not find one. But she knew what was coming. She had known since the moment she sent that email. On Tuesday morning of James's 2nd week, it arrived. Lorraine Tate had been on Caldwell's board for 12 years. She was 71, slim, deliberate, with silver hair she kept short, and a way of entering a room that suggested she had already thought through every conversation she was going to have in it before she arrived. She had served on 3 other boards in that time: a regional hospital network, a mid-size manufacturing concern, a non-profit with a complicated governance structure that she had helped untangle over 4 years. She understood governance the way architects understand load-bearing walls, not as an abstraction, not as a set of rules someone had written down, but as the actual thing that determines whether everything else stays standing. She arrived at Vivian's office at 9:15 on Tuesday morning, without an appointment. Which was its own statement. Lorraine Tate always had an appointment, always respected the scheduling systems that made large organizations function. Coming without one meant she had decided this could not wait and did not want to give Vivian time to prepare. She was carrying a manila folder, closed. She sat in the chair across from Vivian's desk and placed the folder on the desk between them, with the careful placement of someone making a legal argument, not aggressive, but deliberate. Precisely positioned, a document that expected to be taken seriously. "This isn't personal," Lorraine said. Her voice was controlled, practiced without sounding practiced, but the board has a responsibility to organizational standards, and this appointment raises concerns I'm obligated to raise formally. Vivian looked at the folder. She did not reach for it. "Go ahead," she said. Lorraine opened the folder herself, laid out 3 pages with the same deliberateness, a summary of James's personnel file, his educational record, the University of Illinois, the incomplete degree, the withdrawal date, the reason listed as personal circumstances, a timeline of his employment at Caldwell, 6 years in facilities maintenance, and then with no intermediate steps, no search process, no posting, the appointment to Global Communications Liaison. "This appointment was made without a full search process," Lorraine said. "The expedited HR review that was conducted does not substitute for standard vetting procedures. The board was not notified before the announcement went out. The individual has no completed degree and no prior professional experience in any communications capacity." She laid each point down the way a lawyer lays down evidence. "I'm formally requesting that the appointment be reviewed, and that Mr. Webb be returned to his previous role pending a proper process, if one is warranted at all." The last phrase was precise. Deliberate. If one is warranted at all. Not a challenge to James exactly. A challenge to the premise that James belonged in consideration for any role above the one he had come from. Vivian looked at her. She understood what Lorraine was doing. She understood it was not personal in the way that personal usually means not motivated by dislike, not motivated by rivalry or malice, or the small human resentments that sometimes drive institutional behavior. Lorraine Tate genuinely believed in process. She had spent 12 years on this board and 3 other boards protecting organizations from the specific kind of damage that comes from decisions made on instinct rather than structure. She was not wrong to believe in that protection. She was not wrong that Vivian had moved quickly and unconventionally. She was wrong about this specific situation. But she was not wrong about the principle. The expedited review was conducted with the HR director and legal counsel before the offer was sent, Vivian said. "You'll find the documentation in what I sent you yesterday evening." The compensation terms were reviewed. The performance framework is in place. The 30-day evaluation is scheduled. She kept her voice even. The sequence was compressed. Not absent. Lorraine looked at her. "A compressed sequence is not the same as a proper sequence." "I know that," Vivian said. "I'm not arguing otherwise. I'm telling you what was done and what the documentation shows." She paused. "I'll also tell you that I heard your concerns, and I'll address them formally at whatever board session you want to schedule." Lorraine nodded once. She closed the folder, left it on the desk, rose and left without further ceremony because further ceremony would have been theater. And Lorraine Tate did not do theater. Vivian looked at the closed door for a long time. For the first time since Monday morning, she felt the full weight of what she had set in motion. Not doubt she was past doubt, but the specific gravity of a decision that had moved beyond the point where it only affected her. James Webb was on the 31st floor right now, doing his work with the same composure he brought to everything. He had done nothing wrong. He had done everything right. And the institution was organizing itself around the question of whether his presence there was legitimate, not because of anything he had done, but because of the category the institution had assigned him before he did any of it. That was the problem with categories. They did the deciding before the evidence came in. She picked up Lorraine's folder, read every page carefully. Then she put it in her desk drawer, sent the additional documentation she had promised, and went back to work. She had 4 days before she would understand how serious this was going to get. By Thursday of that week, 3 other board members had sent her messages, not demands, not formal requests like Lorraine's, just questions worded carefully, forwarded through assistants, as though they were routine administrative inquiries rather than what they actually were. How was the appointment structured legally? Had the compensation terms been reviewed by outside counsel as well as internal? Was there a performance evaluation framework in place? What was the timeline for formal role assessment? Had the 30-day review criteria been defined in writing? Each question, taken alone, was reasonable. The kind of question a conscientious board member might ask about any unusual personnel decision. Taken together, arriving within 48 hours of each other, covering the same 4 areas of concern, forwarded through assistants rather than sent directly, which gave everyone involved plausible distance from the coordination. They were not questions. They were a record being built. Methodically, with the patience of people who understood that institutional pressure does not need to be loud to be effective. It simply needs to be consistent. It needs to be documented. It needs to accumulate until the weight of it demands a formal response. Lorraine Tate had not acted alone. Vivian understood this with the cold clarity of someone who had been in enough boardrooms to recognize managed dissent when she encountered it. This was coordinated. Not conspiratorial. Nobody in this group was acting from malice or personal animus. They were acting from the shared conviction that process mattered and that Vivian had cut corners on it, and they were building the kind of record that would give them institutional standing if they needed to push further. She answered every question in writing, documented, precise. She acknowledged the irregularity of the timeline and provided evidence of the safeguards. She did not apologize. She was careful not to be defensive, which was harder than not apologizing. Defensiveness concedes that there is something to defend against. She was not conceding that she could feel the pressure building. She could not ignore it indefinitely. But she had 4 weeks until the next scheduled board session, and she had a plan for what those 4 weeks were going to produce. The plan arrived on Thursday afternoon in the form of a phone call. Raymond Hale called her at 4:15. Raymond was Caldwell's head of international partnerships, careful, politically sophisticated, a man who had survived 4 CEO transitions by always knowing which way the wind was moving before it shifted. He had the particular skill of delivering difficult news in a tone so measured that the difficulty of the news didn't fully register until after he had stopped talking. When Raymond called, rather than emailed, it meant he had decided not to put something in writing. "I need to bring you a situation," he said. In person, he was in her office 12 minutes later. The Meridian Group, European-based logistics conglomerate, operations across 12 countries, including 3 where Caldwell had recently been trying to expand. Their current contract with Caldwell, $22 million annually, renewable, one of 3 anchor international partnerships, was up for renewal in 30 days. Their lead negotiating team had arrived in Chicago 48 hours ahead of schedule. "With amendments we haven't reviewed," Raymond said. His voice was the voice of a man delivering news he would have preferred not to be delivering. Their position is that they want to discuss the contract terms directly, in a substantive session, before the scheduled renewal date. They've indicated the amendments are significant. Vivian waited. Raymond cleared his throat. Their lead negotiator is a man named Stefan Brauer. He conducts all substantive negotiations in German, has for 15 years. His 2 accompanying executives handle the French and Russian-speaking market segments respectively, and prefer to negotiate in their primary languages, not out of inability to work in English, but as a matter of professional practice. They've communicated this preference clearly. Vivian looked at him. "And the external language firm? Can't staff a 3-language simultaneous team on 48 hours' notice." "I've already called them," he said it without apology. It was simply a fact that had to be on the table. "The meeting is scheduled for 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, $22 million. One of 3 anchor international partnerships. 48 hours, 3 languages. And on the 31st floor at the end of a corridor, in an office that smelled of cardboard and old paper, a man named James Webb was cross-referencing documents in Portuguese, with a crayon drawing in the corner of his desk. "I'll handle it," Vivian said. Raymond looked at her for a moment. Something moved across his face, not doubt exactly, but the careful recalibration of a man revising his understanding of what she meant by handle. "Vivian," he said. His voice was quieter now. "The board situation, I know about the board situation. If this meeting goes badly, I know that too," he nodded. Once, stood, left without saying anything else, because there was nothing else to say. The math was clear to both of them. She sat alone in her office for a long moment. $22 million. Lorraine Tate's folder. 3D board members coordinated questions. James Webb 1 floor below. She got up, took the elevator down 1 floor, and walked the corridor to the small office at the end. The light under his door was still on. She knocked once. He looked up. He was at his desk, focused, the legal pad covered in compact handwriting, more notes, more cross-referencing, the accumulated evidence of a person who spent his working hours actually working. The drawing still in the corner. "No plus, Dad. I need to talk to you," she said. Okay, she came in. Did not sit. There was only one chair and it was his, and somehow standing felt right for what she was about to say. She stood near the door, where he could see her clearly, where there was nothing between them but the few feet of space, and whatever the next few minutes were going to contain. She gave him all of it. Meridian Group, Stefan Brouwer, German, French, Russian, $22 million annually. The meeting at 10 tomorrow morning, the contract history he hadn't seen, the 48-hour window, the amendments that nobody on the Caldwell side had reviewed, and then the other part. Lorraine's formal request was now in front of 2 additional board members. 3 others had sent questions that were questions in form and something else in substance. The situation was being built into a record. If the Meridian meeting produced any incident, any miscommunication, any breakdown, any outcome that could be attributed to the unconventional staffing of the role, it would not just cost James the position. It would cost Vivian the argument she needed to keep him in it. She would have expended her political capital, defending a decision that had, by that point, produced 2 problematic outcomes. The board would have documented institutional concern, and the next conversation would not be about a deferral. She said this directly. She did not soften it. She did not frame it as a motivational speech or dress it in the language of opportunity. She had decided on the way down in the elevator that the only thing she owed this man, the only thing that was genuinely respectful of who he was and how he operated, was honesty. He had given her honesty from the first moment she had approached him in the lobby. She owed him the same. He listened to all of it without expression. Without the visible processing that most people do when they receive difficult information, the micro-expressions of surprise or concern or recalibration. He simply listened. With the complete attention he gave everything, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked 2 questions. The first, could he have access to the full Meridian contract history, going back 3 years? She had expected that. Yes, I'll have it in your inbox within the hour. The second question was not what she expected. He looked at the desk, not at her. At the desk, at the space in front of him, or at something he was seeing that wasn't in the room. If the meeting goes badly, he said, and I lose this position. He stopped, started again. Do I go back to facilities, or does that not work anymore either? The room was very quiet. Vivian understood the question completely. He was not asking about himself, not about his professional status or his reputation, or what people on the 31st floor would say. He was asking about the math of his life, the specific, non-negotiable arithmetic of a single parent who could not afford a gap, who could not afford a period of uncertainty or transition, or the graceful limbo that people with savings accounts and partners and safety nets could afford, who had structured everything, every decision for 5 years around the fixed point of that boy at Jefferson Elementary and the 315 pickup. He was asking, if this goes wrong, is my son okay? She did not have a clean answer. She could make commitments, but commitments have limits, and she knew it, and he knew it, and pretending otherwise would have been an insult to both of them. I don't know, she said. It was the most honest thing she could give him. I can tell you I'll do everything in my power to make sure you're not left without options, but I can't promise you a specific outcome. I don't think you want me to. James looked at her. It was the first time she had seen something in his face that was not composure. It was not fear exactly, or not only fear. It was the look of a person who has managed uncertainty for so long that managing it has become the structure of their life, who is now being asked to manage a larger quantity of it than usual, with higher stakes than usual, and who is fully aware that the stakes are not really about them. They were about Noah. Okay, he said. That was all. One word. Then he turned back to his screen and opened a new document. Send me the contract history. I'll be ready at 10. Vivian left. In the elevator going back up to 32, she closed her eyes for the length of the ride. Just those few seconds. She thought about a man who had asked not what happens to me, but what happens to him, who was now preparing to walk into a 3-language negotiation for $22 million, because that was the work in front of him, and he was going to do it the same way he had done everything. With total preparation, zero performance. the absolute priority of making sure the fixed point of his life remained fixed. The elevator doors opened. She went back to work. She stayed until 9:15, and when she finally left the building, she walked 2 blocks north to the edge of the river. She stood there for a few minutes in the cold October air, looking at the water and the lights of the city reflected in it, broken and reassembled by the movement of the surface, recognizable but changed. She thought about what it means to be good at something the world has decided you are not qualified to do. She thought about all the years. Then she walked home, and she slept more soundly than she had in weeks. The Meridian team arrived at 9:45. Stefan Brouwer came through the conference room door first, and the room understood immediately why he led negotiations. He was tall, angular, mid-50s, with the particular authority of someone who has sat at the negotiating table many times over many years, and has stopped needing to perform confidence because it has simply become the material he is made of. Not a posture he adopts, but a quality he carries the way other people carry their posture. He greeted Vivian in English, formally, correctly. His English was excellent, precise, without warmth, without the slight softening that people sometimes deploy to signal goodwill before the work begins. He was not here to signal goodwill. He was here to negotiate a contract that mattered to his company, and he intended to negotiate it on terms that his company could work with. Then, turning to his colleagues, he directed the remainder of his opening remarks in German. It was a deliberate signal, not aggressive, but deliberate. He was establishing the language of the room before the other side could, setting the default before the default could be assumed. He was good. Vivian recognized the move and respected it. The 2 colleagues took their seats. Isabel, French markets, late 40s, with the composed efficiency of someone who had been in difficult rooms and come out of them well. Her composure was not the composure of someone who had nothing at stake. It was the composure of someone who had learned to hold high stakes without wearing them on her face. Pavel, Russian and Eastern European portfolio, 50s, watchful in a particular way, the kind of watchful that comes from training yourself to observe what people reveal when they think no one is measuring them. James was already at the table. He had been there since 9:20. His copy of the Meridian contract history was in front of him, margins dense with handwriting, key passages underlined in a system of notation he had developed over the previous evening, sections flagged with small paper clips at angles that meant something he alone knew. A single page of his own preparation notes sat face down on the table. When Brouwer entered, James stood. He introduced himself, name and role, and then addressed Stefan Brouwer directly in German. Not a greeting exactly, a statement, brief and specific, that referenced something in the contract history that Brouwer would recognize as requiring preparation to know. Brouwer stopped, not visibly, not in a way the rest of the room would have registered. But Vivian caught it, the precise, recalibrating stillness of a man who had entered a room holding certain assumptions and had just encountered evidence that at least one of those assumptions was wrong. He responded in German. Something brief. Testing, James answered. For 30 seconds, the 2 of them exchanged something the rest of the room could not follow. Then James turned back to the table and said, in English, without drama, he says he appreciates the preparation. He'd like to begin with the amendment to Section 7. What followed over the next 3 hours was unlike anything Vivian had witnessed in 20 years of professional rooms. James held 3 rooms at once. German business negotiation operates on structured directness. Positions are stated clearly. Ambiguity is considered disrespectful rather than diplomatic. When Brouwer said something, he meant it exactly as he said it, and expected a response to exactly what he said, not to what someone thought he might have meant or to what would be convenient for the other side to have him mean. French professional communication layers formality and relationship into every exchange. It is not evasive, it is calibrated. Every statement acknowledges that the people in the room have a relationship that extends beyond this transaction, and that the relationship has value worth maintaining. Isabel was not softening her positions. She was presenting them in a register that honored the context in which they were being presented. Russian business culture operates on long-game logic. Pavel was probing. Every statement he made was designed to locate the genuine bottom line beneath the stated position, not to deceive, but to understand what was actually true under the surface of what was being presented. He was applying to the negotiation the patience of someone who understood that the first several exchanges are reconnaissance, not conclusion. James held all three simultaneously, not sequentially, not by switching modes when he switched languages, but genuinely simultaneously, tracking all three cultural frequencies in real time and responding to each in its own register. When Brower stated a hard position on the pricing structure in German, James translated it accurately for the Caldwell team, and then, before anyone could react, addressed Isabel in French in a way that acknowledged the concern without conceding the point. The directness of the German position could read, in a French register, as dismissiveness. James neutralized that reading without falsifying the substance. When Pavel raised a structural objection in Russian that carried an embedded suggestion that the Meridian Group had alternatives worth exploring, that their presence at this table was a courtesy rather than a necessity, James translated it accurately. Then he provided the room with one additional sentence: that this phrasing was standard negotiating posture in this context, not a genuine withdrawal signal. The Caldwell team could respond to what was actually happening rather than to its surface presentation. He said this without editorializing, without making Pavel look like he had been caught at something. He said it the way you might provide context about weather information delivered calmly, useful, not charged. The amendment to Section 7 was resolved by noon. 2 additional amendments followed. Both resolved before 1:30. At 1:47 in the afternoon, Stefan Brower signed the renewal documentation. When he stood to leave, he moved around the table. Handshakes, professional, correct. When he reached James, he stopped. He addressed James directly in German, not briefly, not in the clipped register of professional courtesy. He spoke for nearly a full minute. Something in it that felt, to Vivian, like a man choosing to say something rather than something the situation required. Then he shook James's hand, shook Vivian's hand, nodded to the room, and left with his team, the conference room emptied. Vivian and James were the last ones. Documents scattered across the table. Chicago going amber outside the window. What did he say? Vivian asked. The full minute, James squared his annotated pages slowly. He said Caldwell is the first American company in his 15 years in this market that has actually met them. He paused. Not translated. Met. He said there's a difference, and most companies never discover what it is. He placed the pages in his folder. He intends to recommend expanding the partnership scope at the next executive review. A pause. And he asked why I was only being called in now. Why it took this long. The room was quiet. Vivian had no answer. Not one she could say without it being an indictment of 6 years of Monday mornings. I don't have a good answer for that, she said. James looked at her. Something in his expression that was not quite a smile, not accusatory. The settled recognition of a man who had already made peace with a question that didn't have a good answer, and who appreciated that she hadn't manufactured one. I know, he said. He stood, picked up his folder, summary of session outcomes in your inbox by 7, and he left. Vivian sat alone in the empty conference room for several minutes. $22 million, 3 languages, 3 hours, 1 man. She thought, bring it, not with anger, with the grounded clarity of a person who knows what she saw and is not going to pretend otherwise for anyone's comfort. She had looked up on a Monday morning in October. She was not going to look away now. The meeting was scheduled for Tuesday at 10. Vivian had requested it herself, which meant she controlled the agenda, which meant she had decided, before she walked into that room, exactly what she was going to say and exactly what she was not going to say. She was not going to apologize. She was not going to explain herself as though the decision required defending from a position of weakness. She was not going to perform humility she did not feel or concede ground she did not believe needed conceding. What she was going to do was show them the numbers. She arrived at the boardroom at 9:52, 8 minutes early. She placed a single printed page face down at each of the 7 seats around the table. 1 page, no cover sheet, no presentation deck, no 40-slide summary of strategic rationale. 1 page placed face down, which meant 7 people were going to sit down and immediately want to know what was on the other side of it. Then she stood at the window and watched Chicago going about its Tuesday morning below. The river, the towers, the ordinary, continuous movement of a city that did not know or care what was about to happen in this room. They came in 1s and 2s. 7 board members total for this session. Lorraine Tate arrived 3rd. She looked at the face-down page at her seat without touching it, and sat with the composed readiness of a person who had spent the weekend preparing for exactly this conversation and had arrived knowing what she was going to say. When everyone was seated, Vivian turned from the window. "Thank you for making time," she said. "I'll be brief." She nodded toward the pages. "You can turn those over." The sound of 7 pages being flipped. Then silence while 7 people read. The page contained 4 items, each one documented, each one with a name attached, not James's name, but the name of the Caldwell team member who had confirmed the outcome in writing. The first, the Dubai meeting. Letter of intent, signed. Follow-up session confirmed and scheduled. Estimated contract value $14 million. Time from identification of need to sign documentation, 6 hours. The second, the Meridian Group renewal, $22 million annually. Signed. Expanded partnership scope, formally recommended by lead negotiator for executive review. Contract secured with 48 hours notice. No external language firm available. 3 languages handled simultaneously in a 3-hour session, the third and fourth. 2 additional instances in the preceding 3 weeks. A stalled correspondence with a Munich-based supplier, stalled for 11 days, resolved in a single 30-minute call. A Sao Paulo partnership meeting that 3 separate department heads had anticipated would require multiple sessions and likely a site visit. Resolved in 1 session with a handshake and a dinner invitation extended by the Brazilian side. Vivian let them read. She did not rush them. She did not fill the silence. Lorraine finished first. She placed the page flat on the table in front of her and looked at it for a moment longer before looking up. The expression on her face was the expression of a person who has prepared a careful argument and arrived to find that the terrain has shifted in a way that requires recalibration, but not retreat. "I appreciate the summary," she said, "and I want to be clear that nothing in these outcomes changes the procedural concerns I raised." "I know," Vivian said. The appointment was made without a full search process. The board was not notified before the announcement. "Those are institutional facts." "They are," Vivian agreed. "You're right about both of those things." Lorraine waited. She had expected resistance on the procedural points. The agreement required a slight recalibration. The process was compressed. Vivian continued. "I made a decision quickly, under genuine time pressure, and I documented it as I went: the HR review, the legal sign-off, the performance framework. It was not the standard sequence. I'm not arguing that it was." She paused. "What I'm here to tell you is that the question this board needs to answer is not whether the sequence was unconventional." She let that land. "The question is whether the outcome justifies the decision, and whether Caldwell Global is the kind of organization that can recognize value when it appears in a form the standard process wouldn't have surfaced." She reached into the folder she had brought and placed a second document at the center of the table. 1 copy for the room. That is James Webb's formal performance record for his first 3 weeks in the role. Every meeting, every outcome, every piece of documented feedback from every department he's served. Compiled by HR at my request. She looked at Lorraine directly. "I'm asking the board to read it before calling a vote on your review request." The room had a specific quality of silence that Vivian had learned to read over 11 years. There was the silence of a room that had made up its mind. There was the silence of a room that was genuinely uncertain. There was the silence of a room waiting to see who spoke first. This was the third kind. Arthur Cole, board member, no relation, who had been quiet through the entire session, turned the performance document toward him and began reading. That small movement, the quiet decision of one person to engage with the evidence, shifted something in the room. 2 others followed. Lorraine looked at the document, then at Vivian, then at the document. She did not pick it up immediately. When she did, she read it slowly, with the careful attention of someone encountering something they were not expecting and were not going to rush past. 4 minutes of silence. Then Lorraine set the document down. "I'll defer the review request," she said, "pending the 30-day evaluation, not an endorsement." Her voice was precise about that. It was a deferral, a concession that the evidence on the table did not support moving forward, without conceding that the principle had been wrong. It was exactly as much as Lorraine Tate would give. "It was enough, thank you," Vivian said, simply. Without triumph, Arthur Cole closed the performance document and slid it back toward the center of the table. The 30-day evaluation. Will that include the Meridian follow-up? Yes, and the Dubai session. And whatever comes between now and then, he nodded. Something in his expression that was not quite approval but was not its opposite either. At the door on her way out, Lorraine paused. She didn't fully turn. The numbers are the numbers, she said. Her voice was the same controlled voice she had brought in. The review will be thorough. A pause. But the numbers are the numbers. She left. The meeting ended at 10:43. Vivian walked back to her office alone. She did not feel victorious. She felt the way you feel after you have done a difficult thing correctly, not elated but settled, grounded in a way that is quieter than celebration and more durable than relief. She sat at her desk. She opened a new document. She started preparing for the Dubai follow-up. Wednesday. 6:15 in the evening, most of the 31st floor had gone home. The overhead lights had shifted to their after-hours setting, dimmer, cooler, the kind of light that makes a space feel more like itself than it does during business hours. Less performance. More truth. Derek Shaw was at the coffee station at the end of the main corridor. He had been staying later since James arrived on the floor. Vivian had noticed this through the small informational channels she kept open, not surveillance, just awareness. She didn't know whether it was because he was working harder, or because he was processing something, or because the presence of James Webb in the building after hours made him feel, in some way he hadn't articulated to himself, that he needed to be there too. James came around the corner at 6:17, heading for the elevator. He saw Derek. Derek saw him. Neither of them looked away. This was the thing about a floor that watched everything. Eventually the watching had to stop and something real had to happen. You cannot maintain indefinite observation of a person without eventually arriving at a moment where you are simply two people in a corridor, and the choice is whether to say something true or keep performing indifference. Derek set his coffee cup down. "I've been here 9 years, he said. His voice was not hostile, not warm either. It was the voice of a man saying something he had been carrying for 2 weeks and had decided, in this empty corridor with no audience and no stakes beyond the truth of it, to finally set down. James stopped walking. He did not tense. He did not calculate. He simply stopped and turned and gave Derek the same full attention he gave everything. "I know," James said. "I have a degree. I applied for a global communications role last spring. Prepared for 2 years, I know that too." Derek looked at him. He had expected something else. A defense, maybe, or a reframing, the careful repositioning of uncomfortable facts that people usually do when they are in a position of advantage and someone below them pushes back. James did not reframe. "I don't have a good answer for you," James said. "I can't tell you the process was fair to you. I don't know enough about your application to say that, and even if I did, I'm not sure what fair looks like in a situation like this." Derek was quiet. "What I can tell you," James continued, "is that I didn't come here to take something from you. I came here to do a job that was in front of me, and I'm going to do it the same way. I've done every job as well as I possibly can." He said it without apology and without aggression, without the careful hedging of someone managing a conversation toward a predetermined destination. He said it the way he said everything, directly, with the settled quality of a person who had decided a long time ago that honesty was less expensive than its alternatives. "That doesn't fix anything for you," James added. "I know that." Derek looked at him for a long moment. He was 43 years old. He had spent 9 years at Caldwell building something he believed in. He had a master's degree from Northwestern. He had prepared, genuinely prepared, for a role that had gone to someone who had not applied, and had not interviewed, and had not followed any of the steps that Derek had understood, since the beginning of his professional life, to be the steps you followed. He was angry about that. He had been angry since the announcement. Standing in this corridor, in the after-hours light, looking at a man who had just told him the truth without packaging it, the anger was still there. But something else was there too. Something he hadn't expected. He picked up his coffee. "You speak 9 languages?" he said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a fact he was finally saying out loud to the person it was about. Working on the 9th, James said. Something moved across Derek's face. Not quite a smile. The expression of a person who has been holding something rigid and has felt it shift, not break, not dissolve, just shift. "How?" Derek said. "When? How does a person do that?" James looked at him. "Slowly," he said. "Early mornings, late nights. You find the hours other people use for other things and you use them for this instead. For how long? Longer than 6 years. Derek was quiet, processing that. My son needs me to have stable income, James said. That was the priority. Everything else fit around that. The languages weren't a plan. They were what I did with the time I had. Derek nodded slowly. He picked up his laptop bag, started walking toward the elevator. At the corner he stopped. He didn't turn around. The Sao Paulo thing. The meeting last week. That was my account. I know, James said. You did good work on it. He turned the corner. His footsteps faded. James stood alone at the coffee station for a moment. Then he went to the elevator. 3 weeks later, Derek Shaw knocked on the door of the small office at the end of the hall. He had a question about a French client communications that had become complicated in a way he couldn't resolve with translation software and professional distance. James spent 20 minutes with him, explaining not just the language but the cultural logic underneath it. The way certain phrases in French professional communication carried relationship history that English equivalents didn't. The way a response that seemed cold to an American reader might simply be formal to a French one, not rejection, just register. Derek listened, asked 2 follow-up questions, went back to his desk and sent the email. The French client responded within the hour. Positively, nobody made it a moment, nobody needed to. 4 weeks after the board meeting, on a Tuesday in November, Vivian left the office at 3 o'clock. She had blocked the afternoon for document review at home, away from the interruptions of 32, away from the assistants and the emails and the particular ambient pressure of being the CEO in the CEO's office. She had a board preparation call at 6. The afternoon was hers. She walked to her car in the building's parking structure, drove north on Wacker, then turned west on Adams. The city in early November had a different quality than October. The light lower, the trees bare now, the tourists gone, Chicago settling into the long, serious work of winter. She caught a red light at the intersection a block before Jefferson Elementary. She was reaching for her phone, a message from her assistant about the 6 o'clock call, when something in her peripheral vision made her look up. Jefferson Elementary. Right there, half a block ahead on the left. 3:12 in the afternoon, the school day had just ended. Students coming through the main entrance, the particular released energy of people who have been sitting still for 7 hours and have now been given permission to move. Voices carrying in the cold air. James was at the gate. He was in his work clothes, the pressed shirt, the dark slacks of his new role, though his shift had ended more than an hour ago. Standing at the pickup gate with the still, unhurried posture she had come to recognize as simply the way he occupied space. Not waiting impatiently, not checking his phone, not managing his time or thinking about the next thing, just there, present. The way you are present when the thing you are waiting for is the most important part of your day, and you have known it long enough that you don't need to remind yourself anymore. Noah came through the gate at a run. Backpack bouncing. He had something in his hand, a piece of paper, held out in front of him like an offering, like something he had been carrying all day and had been waiting to give. James crouched down. Not the half-crouch of a distracted adult making a physical accommodation. All the way down, eye level with his son. The way you get down when you intend to actually see what someone is showing you, when you have decided that the showing matters. Noah held up the paper. Even from this distance, through the car window, in the November light, Vivian could see the shapes. The confident, uncomplicated lines of a child who draws without self-consciousness, who has not yet learned to be tentative about what he makes. She could see James's face. He was looking at the drawing, the way he looked at everything that mattered, with full attention. Unhurried, without the slight vacancy that enters a person's eyes when they are present in body, but somewhere else in mind. He was looking at his son's drawing, the way he had looked at Hamdan al-Khalidi across a conference table, and at 3 pages of annotated contract history, and at her in her office, when she had told him something true and needed him to hear it. The same quality of attention, all the way present, all the way there. Noah said something. James answered. Noah laughed, clear and unguarded, the laugh of a child who doesn't yet know to hold anything back. James pointed at something in the drawing, asked a question. Noah launched into explanation with both hands moving, the way children explain things when they have been waiting all day to explain them. James listened, the light changed. Vivian sat for 1 more second, just one. Then she drove. She drove the remaining blocks home and sat in her car in front of her building for a while before going in. She was thinking about a man who had decided in the worst year of his life what the center of things was, who had organized everything else around that center with the calm, unshakable logic of a person who had looked directly at loss and come out of it not smaller but clearer, who had carried his grief and his 9 languages and his son's school schedule and 6 years of invisibility through the lobby of a glass tower on South Wacker Drive, with the same composure, the same quality of presence he brought to everything, who had never asked the world to notice, who had simply shown up every day, to the lobby, to the mop, to the marble floor, to the Arabic and the Spanish and the German, to the pickup gate on West Adams at 3:15 every day, with the same quality of attention he had given that drawing. She thought about all the things she had walked past in 11 years without looking up. She thought about all the buildings in all the cities in this country where the same thing was happening. The quiet, unannounced capability of people the system had decided did not belong in the rooms where decisions were made. The people who kept doing the work with care and dignity and the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided not to become less, just because no one is looking. She went upstairs, made tea, sat at her kitchen table, and she started writing. The announcement went out 6 weeks after that Monday morning in the lobby company-wide. From Vivian's office. A straightforward memo, 4 paragraphs, in the plain language she used when she wanted to be sure something was understood rather than admired. It announced the creation of the Caldwell Hidden Talent Review. The program worked like this. Any employee at Caldwell Global, regardless of their current role or department or floor or title, could submit a skills profile. A document structured but not rigid in which they could describe capabilities they had that their current position did not use or reflect. Languages spoken, certifications held, degrees earned, work done before Caldwell, skills developed on their own time, anything real that the standard HR file hadn't asked for and therefore didn't contain. The profiles would be reviewed by a cross-departmental panel that included representatives from HR, from senior management, and from the relevant practice areas, where the panel identified a genuine mismatch real capability in a real area where Caldwell had real need. The company would work to create a pathway, not a promise. A pathway. The memo was careful about that distinction. Vivian had rewritten that sentence 4 times to make sure it said exactly what she meant. A promise was something she could not always keep. Promising someone a role that might not exist, or that they might not be right for once the full picture emerged, would be worse than not promising anything. A pathway was something she could always try to build. The effort was what she was committing to. The direction, not the destination. The tone was practical throughout. No inspirational language. No words like transformative or historic or groundbreaking. No reference to any individual by name. No positioning of the program as a response to anything that had happened. Just, we may have people in this building who are more than what their current role reflects. We want to know. Vivian pressed send at 2:47 in the afternoon. By 4 o'clock, her assistant had forwarded her 18 responses. They were different from the responses to James's appointment announcement. Those had been objections, the defensive reaction of a system encountering something it hadn't anticipated. These were something else entirely, a mix of curiosity and caution, and the particular tone that people use when they have been waiting for permission to say something, and have finally, tentatively, received it. A woman from the mailroom who had a background in graphic design had spent 3 years producing the internal newsletter layout because nobody had asked, but it had needed doing, and she had the skill and simply applied it. She had never mentioned it to anyone. Nobody had asked. A man from building security who held a paralegal certification from a 2-year program. He had been applying to positions in Caldwell's legal support team for 4 years. Each time, the automated system had screened him out because the posted requirements specified a 4-year degree. He had the certification and 2 years of night school coursework. The system had said no without reading further. A woman from the catering team on 26, who had a master's degree in data analysis from a university in another country, a credential the HR system had never been set up to evaluate because it hadn't been issued by an American institution. She had been analyzing catering data on her own, in her own time, producing reports nobody had asked for because she couldn't stop herself from seeing patterns. She had kept the reports in a folder on her personal computer for 2 years. Each profile was different. Each one was a person. Each one was a gap between what the system had decided someone was and what that person actually contained. Vivian read everyone. It took her until 7:30 that evening. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the stack of printed profiles on her desk. She could not quite name what she felt. It was not pride exactly, not the satisfaction of having done something strategically smart. It was larger and quieter than that. It was the feeling of understanding, with full clarity, how much was always there, how much had always been there in every building, on every floor, in every role the system had assigned without asking. How much capability and knowledge and skill had been present all along. Invisible not because it was hidden, but because nobody had thought to ask the right question. The question was not complicated. It was, who are you actually? Not what degree do you have? Not what title have you held? Not what box does your resume fit in? Just, who are you actually? What do you know? What can you do that we don't know you can do? She thought about James Webb mopping the lobby for 6 years, while hundreds of people walked past. She thought about all the lobbies. She thought about all the people in all the lobbies, showing up every day with care and precision, and the particular dignity of someone who has decided not to become smaller, just because no one is paying attention. Then she closed the profiles, turned off the desk lamp, and went home. Thursday afternoon. 2 days after the announcement, Vivian was at her desk, working through the preparation documents for the Dubai follow-up session. When she heard the knock, her office door was open. She looked up. James was standing in the doorway. He was in his work clothes, the pressed shirt, the dark slacks, holding a folder in one hand, with the relaxed ease of someone who had just come from finishing something. His expression was the same expression she had first seen in the lobby 6 weeks ago, when she had stopped walking and turned around and looked at him for the first time. Calm, settled. The particular composure of a person who has made peace with a world that underestimated him and is still deciding carefully, without rushing, what to do with a world that doesn't. I saw the announcement, he said. Good, Vivian said. He looked at her for a moment, not measuring, not calculating. Just looking at her the way he looked at things fully, without the fraction of attention held in reserve that most people maintain as a form of self-protection. It's a good program, he said. She could hear the absence of performance in it. No flattery. No professional warmth deployed strategically. He had read the announcement, formed an opinion, and was telling her the opinion. The opinion happened to be positive. But it would have been the same delivery if it hadn't been. We already have 18 profiles, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Small, just at the edges of his eyes. 18, he said. In 2 days, he looked down for a moment at the folder in his hand, or at the space between what a building looks like from the outside and what it actually contains inside all those floors and offices and storage rooms and corridors. There will be more, he said. I know. He nodded. Started to turn, James. He looked back. She had been trying for 6 weeks to find the right thing to say. Not in the meetings. Not in the crisis moments when there was always a function to perform and a purpose to serve. In a moment like this one, ordinary, unhurried, without any agenda beyond the simple truth of what she wanted to say, she still hadn't found the right sentence. She was not sure there was one. I'm glad I stopped walking, she said. He looked at her. It was the longest look he had given her. Long enough that she was aware of it. Long enough to feel like something real passing between two people who had spent 6 weeks moving through the same building toward the same outcomes, and had not, until this moment, quite arrived at the thing underneath all of it. So am I, he said. He turned and walked back down the corridor. She watched him go, the pressed shirt. The easy, unhurried walk of a man who had learned, not been taught, not stumbled into, but genuinely learned, over years of difficult mornings, that dignity was not something the world gave you. It was something you decided to keep, regardless of what floor you worked on. Regardless of what the title above your name said. Regardless of whether anyone in the building was paying attention, the folder under his arm. The small office at the end of the hall. The window that faced the side of another building instead of the skyline, and the drawing in the corner, Noe, plus DAD. She turned back to her screen. She thought about the Monday morning 6 weeks ago. The coffee going cold. the Arabic cutting through the lobby like something alive and precise, the mop against the wall, the face she had never looked at, looking back at her with the calm of someone who had very little left to prove. She thought about what she had almost done. She had almost kept walking. She was a person who kept walking 11 years of evidence. 11 years of coffee in hand, purposeful forward momentum confirmed that. The board call was in 8 minutes. Her schedule was clean. Her eyes were forward. She had almost not stopped. The thought sat with her. Not with guilt. She had not been wrong to have the habits she had. Only wrong to let them become so absolute that a voice in a lobby couldn't break through them. Not with regret, exactly, though there was something adjacent to regret in it. Just as a fact about the narrowness of things. How much can depend on whether a person stops or keeps walking? How much can change because of one turn of the head toward a sound that doesn't fit the expected pattern? She was glad she had stopped. She was glad she had turned. She was glad, most of all, that she had asked. Outside, Chicago continued doing what Chicago does. The towers on South Wacker Drive caught the late afternoon light and held it briefly before letting it go. The river moved in its slow, steady way between its banks. On West Adams, Jefferson Elementary had sent its students home an hour ago, and somewhere in this building, in the small office at the end of the 31st floor hallway, in what had been a storage room before it became something else, a man who spoke 9 languages was reading a contract in Portuguese and filling a legal pad with notes in 2 languages and doing his work with the same care he had brought to every floor he had ever worked on. Not because anyone was watching, because that was who he was. Talent doesn't announce itself. It doesn't carry the right credentials, or stand in the right part of the building, or fill out the forms in the order the system expects. It doesn't wait to be discovered. It simply keeps going through the early shifts and the late nights and the grief and the logistics of raising a child alone. And the particular invisibility of being someone a building full of professionals has decided, without asking, has nothing to offer. It keeps going because stopping would mean becoming less than what it is. And some things, once they have decided what they are, do not know how to become less. The question was never whether James Webb was capable. The question, the only question that had ever mattered, the question that had been sitting unanswered for 6 years in the lobby of a glass tower on South Wacker Drive, was whether someone was paying enough attention to ask. On a Monday morning in October, someone had. Everything else followed from that.